after reading this book and reading something about this book on your site, one of the sentences that it started with was, "The Accidental Anarchist is the remarkable true story of an ordinary man who gets caught up in the history-making events of the early 1900s in Russia." And in no way did I see this Jacob Marateck as an ordinary man. He was, you felt like you got to know him through this book and admire him for his strengths, his faith, his positive attitude, his wit.
But I grew up hearing stories about this grandfather I never knew from my mother, who made him sound like something of a Jewish superhero. Although from what I understood, you know, he was daring, impulsive, and completely unconcerned about consequences. And that rather made him sound to me like a cross between Maxwell Smart and Bart Simpson. He was constantly getting into trouble, as you can understand from burning 3 death sentences. But after working with his diaries for several years and having his voice in my head, I came to understand something more about him. It wasn't just that he was impulsive. He just had a very strong need to stand up for what he believed in and to defend the people that he cared about, despite the consequences, which were quite severe. Mostly, he had a sense of humor and optimism that really characterized his way of looking at the world. It wasn't long before he found his first adventure. And in fact, it was practically his first day in the Army when his commanding officer referred to him by a term that was very common at the time, a way of referring to Jews that Jacob must have heard 100 times before. The phrase is Żydowska morda, and it means Jew face or Jew snout. So even having heard this for most of his life, for some reason on this occasion, Jacob took offense. And in fact, he hit his commanding officer over the head with what he had been holding in his hand at the time, which happened to be, not as shiny, an iron tea kettle filled with steaming water. So you can imagine that was a death sentence worthy offense. But now, how many of you are familiar with the Yiddish phrase, "Hak mir nicht gecheinig"? It's one of the very few Yiddish phrases I know from my childhood. It means "stop nagging me." So that tells you something about me as a child. But what it literally means is "don't hit me over the head with a tea kettle." So to explain how I got involved in the book, I actually have to go back 100 years and tell you a story that might not have had me in it. And it begins on the occasion of my grandfather's 3rd death sentence. During the Russo-Japanese War, Jacob was horrified to see so many young lives being squandered, and he vowed to see to it that the Czar could never do that again. Following the war, he joined the Polish Revolutionary Underground movement that sought freedom for Poland from Russian occupation and incidentally wanted to overthrow the Czar. And it was in that capacity that he was caught, arrested, and in less time than it takes to sneeze, casually sentenced to death for the 3rd time. But this time, his sentence would be carried out in only 3 days. As he was being led through the streets of Warsaw in chains on the way to the notorious Citadel prison, he happened to spot a young girl getting off the train and for some reason thought she had sympathetic eyes. So with a loud cough, he drew her attention and let her see him drop a note from between his chained palms, hoping she would take that as a hint, pick up the note, follow the instructions to save him. But he had no way of knowing if she would do so, because the next instant the chain yanked him forward, and he suspected that the prisoners behind him probably ground his note into the mud with their boots. So it was only the day before his scheduled execution that he realized she must have done something, because the guards came to get him, dragged him out of the cell, brought to the commandant's office, where he was notified that his sentence had suddenly been commuted to nearly 10 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by permanent exile. Now, that was known as getting a tenor, and it was the equivalent in Russia at the time of being declared not guilty. So his other prisoners, and probably most ordinary people, would be grateful to have a death sentence commuted just to a lifetime in Siberia, but not Jacob Marateck. In fact, he had the chutzpah to escape from Siberia and traveled 3,000 miles back to Warsaw. And the first thing he did was rush over to the apartment of his brother and immediately dismissed all the talk of how he escaped or anything like that. He wanted to know the name of the girl who had picked up the note. Well, her name was Bryna, and she became my grandmother, and it was for her that I was named. So even though I had grown up hearing stories about the diaries and my grandfather's experiences, it was only when I started working on the book that I suddenly realized that somewhere in the back of my mind, I guess because of my name, I had always known that I would someday be the one to fulfill his dream of sharing his stories. Now, given that my grandfather had started keeping these diaries in 1905, why did it take over 100 years to be able to share these stories? Well, he started writing during the war. He occasionally had to drop his fountain pen and pick up a rifle, or throw the fountain pen and the notebook into his rucksack and run, because the Russians were perpetually on the retreat. But even so, he managed to write about 282 pages in his first diary, a cloth-bound notebook that he bought for a nickel at a train station in Harbin, China. My grandfather began telling his stories from the war, his experiences from the battle and from growing up in Russian-occupied Poland and what it was like to be a Jew whom everybody wanted to kill all the time. And he told the stories with that unique sense of humor that he had. And people always loved hearing these stories, and they kept urging him to write down the remaining stories and to publish them, which he had wanted to do, but simply didn't have the time, at least until the Depression. And then in 1930, he sat down to continue writing, and then he didn't stop for the next 20 years. Finally, one day in 1950, he felt he was done. By then, he had filled 28 notebooks, 27 of them being those black and white modeled composition notebooks that we're all used to, and we still have all of them. And he asked my mother, who was his youngest child, if she wanted to help him translate the diaries, because he had written them exclusively in Yiddish with a few Russian and Polish words thrown in. So she was very excited about working on the translation with him and said, "Of course, Papa, let's begin tomorrow when I get home from work." And then something happened that typically only happens in the movies. He passed away that very night. So nothing more was said or thought about the diaries for several years until my grandmother and namesake was towards the end of her life. And my mother at the time was dating my father, who was a writer already, and he later became the first Orthodox writer in Hollywood. He worked on the original Star Trek and Wild Wild West, Mannix, Gunsmoke, Lost in Space, even Dynasty and Law and Order. And if you ever saw an episode of Wild Wild West that had a Jewish wedding in it, that was one of his episodes. He had a patient in medical center who was quoting the Talmud from his hospital bed. My mother brought my father to meet her mother, and hearing he was a writer, my grandmother whispered to my mother, "Show him Papa's diaries." And then in good Jewish mother fashion, she added, "And tell him not to wear that scarf with that coat." So my mother shared the diaries with my father. He had grown up in Germany, so he was fluent in Yiddish too. And he was just as enthralled as everyone else had been by the incredible tone and the sense of humor and optimism that pervaded the diaries, with these remarkable stories about the war in a period of time that we don't usually get to learn about from an eyewitness perspective. And after they got married, they spent somewhere between years and decades translating the diaries. But if I asked my grandfather what was the theme of the book, I'm pretty sure that he would just smile and say all he really wanted was to be able to make people smile. So by inviting me here today to talk to you, you've given me that opportunity to fulfill that part of his dream, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
just moved here recently, and I just got the book within the last week, so I haven't finished it. But I didn't even get past the first page. This was 2 nights ago, when I started reading it aloud to my husband, because I just was so enjoying the way it was written, and that you capture the Jewish humor and the way you wrote it, the intonation, that I could just imagine this Jewish man telling this story. And so I immediately started reading it to my husband aloud, and he also thought it was just wonderful. So
I think it would make a wonderful movie.
Yes.
It would. When I read it, I can think, this is so unbelievable that you could put, this is based on a true story, but it's almost unbelievable, and it would be a great adventure story.
Well, I would love to do that. That's so from your lips to Steven Spielberg.
Can you tell us about your mother's reaction to the book when it was finished?
Oh, she's just been so happy because, like I said, she'd been carrying the torch for her father's dream for, by that point, it was 60 years. So yes, she just loves talking about it to everybody and hearing about it. When I send her reviews, or I periodically get fan letters, which is really cool. So I fax them to her, and she's just really enjoying it.